living a stimulating life and having a lot of dopamine and, feeling excited about life is actually one of the greatest signs of health. Again, not only subjectively, but from a disease prevention standpoint. Hello, everyone. This is Dalton of Analyze and Optimize. Today, we're going to be talking about dopamine. And dopamine, while it is one of the most talked about, I would say, molecules in the sort of health space, it also seems to be one of the least understood, or at least most misrepresented, in my opinion. You often hear things like, dopamine is pleasure, but serotonin is happiness or fulfillment. And then you have people, basically making it out to seem like if you experience any dopamine at all, that you're going to turn into like this fucking guy. And that is just not the case. Especially now when you have people advocating for fasting from dopamine, which is basically just locking yourself in a dark room the whole day and doing absolutely nothing to enjoy yourself or to stimulate your brain. Because as we all know, that any type of pleasure that you may experience is actually terrible. So I think this is actually where a lot of the stigma, the ideas about dopamine potentially being this harmful thing sort of come into play. And that's that we kind of live in this culture where, grinding is glorified, and anytime you're having fun, that's seen as a bad thing. Anytime you're doing something that's pleasurable, it's seen as inherently bad. I think that is probably a huge reason why dopamine seems to be vilified in a number of circumstances. And then you also have the stance of dopamine's role in addiction, which again seems to be very misrepresented in my view, but we'll get into that in a little bit. So first, I want to cover dopamine's functions in general, just real quick. So everyone knows that dopamine is of pleasure, but dopamine is actually a lot of motivation. So if you want to be able to accomplish your goals, or to go talk to that pretty girl, or to, anything that would require a semblance of motivation, you are going to be needing a good amount of dopamine on hand in order to do that. It's also obviously involved with reward and euphoria. And euphoria, again, seems to be this thing where it's like, oh, if you're euphoric, then you must be manic. Actually, had someone on Twitter say that to me, that ssris are not there to make you happy. And in fact, if they did make you happy, that would actually be a medically sound cause for concern, because that would mean that you're insane. It's pretty crazy the world that we live in now. Anyway, so dopamine is also very important for cognitive function. And a lot of people seem to think that dopamine is going to like rot your brain or something. But no, in a functional dopamine deficiency, you are actually going to be suffering a lot of ill cognitive effects from that. And we'll get into some of the conditions about this later. It's also very important for movement. So if you like to lift weights, if you're an athlete, or you just like to have good intestinal function, coordination, being able to write, being able to, play an instrument or whatever it is that you like to do, you're going to need dopamine in order to, have the proper consciousness, essentially, to be able to relate what's going on in your hand or what's going on in your body to how you want to do that in your mind. If we move a little bit into its actual role in addiction, which again, I believe has been misrepresented by a lot of individuals, no shame, but essentially, I really think that this is a problem of low dopamine at baseline, which is kind of synonymous with high serotonin. And we've talked a little bit about this in our video on serotonin. You guys should definitely check that out if you haven't already. But essentially, the main genes that sort of drive addiction seem to be related to dopaminergic dysfunction. And it's never like an excessive dopamine. It's always like a problem with baseline functioning of dopamine. And to go along with this, we also know that certain treatments that can increase dopamine, drugs that can increase dopamine, safely, can actually have some pretty therapeutic benefits in terms of treating addictions. So, the idea that you are just going to get addicted to anything that gives you pleasure is kind of a little misguided in my view, and I think Dr. Pete was right on when he basically said that addiction is essentially the body perceiving something valuable that it's not getting or it has a functional lack of, and then it continues to seek that out. So again, we can make a whole video on addiction. We probably will at some point, but that's just the gist. And then, of course, to exemplify all of this, you have the rat park studies. Again, this is something that we talked about in the serotonin video a little bit, but essentially they found that if you lock up a rat in a cage and you give it access to morphine, then yeah, it's going to do the morphine. But if you take the rat out of the cage and you give it a stimulating environment, you allow it to play with other rats, you give it like rat toys and rat park. That was what they called it. Rats essentially all pretty much self-withdrew from morphine in those studies. So, I mean, is it any coincidence that we're in a situation where more and more people are dealing with addictions? I don't think so. I think that people are stuck into boring, routine jobs and potentially people that they're around, and they find life incredibly monotonous. But if they were to not and have that underlying issue addressed, would they still, be seeking out whatever it is, cigarettes or marijuana or cocaine or heroin, God forbid? But the rat park studies seem to argue for that point. We should really discuss serotonin more in this discussion, because you can't really talk about dopamine without talking about serotonin. And they're essentially like polar opposites in terms of functional effects and the fact that they oppose each other on a physiological and biochemical level. So, anytime you're net increasing serotonin in the body is going to put the brakes on dopamine synthesis and vice versa. So basically, the dopamine synthesis center in the brain is called the substantia nigra. And the substantia nigra, when it synthesizes dopamine, your brain has these circuits, and it can send these, something might be primarily synthesized in one region of the brain, and then it can send it out elsewhere in the brain, wherever it needs to go. So if dopamine is synthesized primarily in the substantia nigra, and then serotonin is primarily synthesized in something called the dorsal raphe nucleus, and the dorsal raphe nucleus synthesis of serotonin, when that is blocked, you have an increase of dopamine, and vice versa. If you block off the substantia nigra, you get an increase in dorsal raphe nucleus serotonin synthesis. And you can also see this in studies where if you give someone a serotonin precursor like 5-HTP, which unfortunately a lot of people seem to use as a supplement, if you administer people with 5-HTP supplements, you get actually a net depletion in their levels of dopamine. And on the converse side, if you administer L-tyrosine, which is if you administer L-dopa, which is a precursor to dopamine synthesis, you can get a brain depletion in serotonin. So the bottom line is that these compounds work pretty much on opposite sides of the spectrum, and they're always typically opposing each other. Dopamine inhibits the enzyme that synthesizes serotonin, so it's called tryptophan hydroxylase, or TPH. It also inhibits the estrogen synthesizing enzyme called aromatase. Dopamine, like I said, it's created in the substantia nigra, but once it gets sent out to these circuits, it can also reach the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is kind of notorious for emitting a set of potentially harmful and inflammatory hormones in excess. And again, it's not that you don't want to have a pituitary gland, but it is definitely the case that pituitary hormones like human growth hormone and prolactin and thyroid stimulating hormone all seem to be involved in various types of diseases and tend to be elevated when health starts to go downhill or people are under stress. And that's mostly true of prolactin. And dopamine is very well known to inhibit the synthesis of prolactin at the level of the pituitary. And because of this, hyperprolactinemia is often treated with L-dopa or with dopamine agonists. So that's not really something that is even controversial. But on the other hand, estrogen and serotonin both tend to promote the release of prolactin. Serotonin and estrogen and prolactin, these compounds, they all play roles in pretty much any disease you can think of. Cancer, heart disease, irritable bowel syndrome, male lactation, infertility. These are not hormones that you want to be out of line. And dopamine is perhaps your primary brake on a number of these through a number of different mechanisms. So not only is it true that dopamine is very important for your subjective quality of life, but it is also incredibly important for your long-term disease prevention from keeping those other hormones sort of in check. Now, the most famous dopaminergic dysfunction condition is Parkinson's, where you have a death of these cells, the neurons that produce dopamine in the substantia nigra. A functional decrease in the level of dopamine is associated with a plethora of other diseases as well. So not only just Parkinson's, but you have this in Alzheimer's, you have this in depression, you can have this in a number of different disorders. Anything where estrogen, serotonin, or prolactin is elevated, which, as we discussed, is going to be most diseases, you can bet that dopamine synthesis is going to be relatively compromised. And on that note, I think that kind of ties in a number of different ideas that, we're told that, feeling pleasure is fucking fly. We're told that feeling pleasure is, something that you want to limit, and that we're kind of sold this idea that, if you want to feel pleasure, like you kind of have to limit it, or you have to like feel bad about it to the point where people are literally fasting from dopamine. But the fact that it has this break on these very important hormones of disease, when they get inappropriately elevated, are huge players in disease. I think that kind of goes to show that, living a stimulating life and having a lot of dopamine and, feeling excited about life is actually one of the greatest signs of health, again, not only subjectively, but from a disease prevention standpoint. And I think this just gives more credence to the idea that listening to your body is so key, because nobody in their right mind would do things that elevate serotonin and lower dopamine if they were completely unbiased and, just had a choice of whatever it is to do. So on that note, we discussed this again in the serotonin video, but serotonin tends to promote states of, it kind of just makes you feel boxed in. It makes you feel numb. It makes you feel anhedonic. And then it's also, unfortunately, involved in a lot of sexual problems. And dopamine is important for fostering, a healthy sexual response and libido. And unfortunately, there's now this whole trend of post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. People coming out having taken SSRIs in the past, now basically having irreversible sexual dysfunction. Again, I think it's because of this break that it puts on the dopamine system. And in fact, I saw even one case report the other day that basically said that administering SSRIs can predispose individuals to Parkinson's disease. So again, serotonin has nothing to do with happiness as far as I'm concerned, but it does tend to promote this sort of anhedonia and numbness, and it can have these horrible pernicious effects on your overall health and well-being. So in terms of raising dopamine, unfortunately, in modern medicine, we normally see this just by administering Adderall, which is obviously not something that I'm a huge fan of. But the reason that I'm not a huge fan of Adderall is not because it is dopaminergic. I'm not a huge fan of Adderall because it acts as a adrenaline and noradrenaline sort of analog, and it also increases their levels of it, I believe, in the synapse. And this also raises cortisol. So if you've ever taken Adderall, you probably notice that you have a suppression in appetite. You have a lot of energy. You probably feel really good because of the dopamine and the adrenaline, the cortisol. But you also will have like heart palpitations. You'll have like a lack of appetite. Your sexual function might not be quite as good. But that does bring up an important point, which is dopamine's sort of relation to adrenaline and noradrenaline. Basically, you start in the sort of synthesis pathway. You can start with either phenylalanine or tyrosine. These are both amino acids that occur in pretty much any kind of protein. Once you consume that protein, then they get converted into something called L-DOPA, and that enzymatic step that happens there is called tyrosine hydroxylase. That's the rate limiting step, meaning that's the one that's most tightly regulated. Once you form L-DOPA, then you go through an enzyme called dopa decarboxylase, which requires vitamin B6. And I believe the dopamine synthesis pathway also requires vitamin C. and iron and some other nutrients that I'm forgetting right now. The important point is that once you form dopamine, it can then get converted into the other catecholamines, which are adrenaline and noradrenaline. Now, just because these chemicals are related, that doesn't mean that they always have to go hand in hand. I think that the formation of all of these compounds is not just supply, but also demand driven. So it doesn't matter if you're eating a lot of protein and you have a lot of B6. If your stress, like subjectively and throughout the rest of your lifestyle, is kept low, you're not just going to be mindlessly synthesizing a bunch of adrenaline and noradrenaline, but you should be, producing a good amount of dopamine, given that everything else is in check. So if you're going to try to increase dopamine, it is very important to make sure that you're well fed, because if you're not, then you will end up synthesizing more of these downstream compounds. Some of my favorite supplements for increasing dopamine would be vitamin B6. You can supplement this in the P5P form. It's like the pyridoxal phosphate. That's like the more active form of vitamin B6, and that will allow you to synthesize more dopamine. I also really like pregnenolone. You guys should check out our link in the description for our buddies over at Health Natural. They have an excellent pregnenolone product that's highly pure, and there's a lot of testimonials from people that have used it. I personally love it. Pregnenolone converts into something called allopregnanolone, which I've also talked about before. And allopregnanolone tends to increase dopamine synthesis while decreasing serotonin. But other than that, I mean, really my main dopaminergic things would be just drinking coffee in the morning. And the most important thing, honestly, is going to be keeping your serotonin low, because trying to increase your dopamine directly, I think that might be a bit of fool's gold, just in the sense that most people have if you have a functional dopamine deficiency, my bet is that it's going to really be a problem of excess serotonin, and that the main cause of excess serotonin in pretty much everybody is going to be gastrointestinal problems. So making sure that your gut is not inflamed, that you're eating easily digestible foods, that your bowels are functioning properly, that you're getting, consistent bowel movements, those kind of things, and that you're not having sort of any irritation or bacterial or fungal overgrowth in the intestines. Those are all going to drive serotonin production, which is ultimately going to affect your dopamine production. And by effect, I mean it's going to drastically lower it and make you feel like shit. So that is going to be the main thing. Of course, using the dopaminergic supplements. Oh, I forgot about methylene blue. We have two links here. One is from Health Natura, and the other is from CZTL. They have an excellent product called MB Pure that I use as well. And methylene blue does, in fact, raise dopamine, and it inhibits prolactin that's induced by estrogen. I can post a study on the screen here. But yeah, I've had a lot of people ask me if methylene blue is going to raise your serotonin, and I don't see that really being a problem in the doses that we're talking about, which is like under 10 milligrams a day. But none of this is medical advice. Always talk to your doctor. The last thing I'd have to say is the main thing for raising dopamine and lowering serotonin is really just going to be your overall lifestyle. Things as simple as, getting up and watching the sunrise and trying to spend time outside, trying to spend time with people that you love and that you care about, and that, you can have good conversations with that actually stimulate you, trying to learn things that, you find interesting, trying to do things that you find are interesting. Those are going to be the real needle movers in terms of decreasing your serotonin and increasing your dopamine. Obviously, everything else that I talked about is important, is very important as well. But that is really the bottom line. And I think that's a primary reason why we are now seeing all these problems of excess serotonin, excess estrogen, excess prolactin, and ultimately a lack of dopamine, combined with the fact that now we have people that are telling you that dopamine is bad and that you're going to get addicted to it, and that you should just fast from dopamine and lock yourself in a cage like the rats. We just run into this massive, massive problem. So anyway, that's all I got for you guys today. If you enjoyed this format, let me know in the comments. Obviously, this is a new type of style that we're trying here, But I figure I post this stuff on Twitter, I post it on Instagram. I may as well try to at least make it into a video and get better with my on-camera skills, because obviously that kind of sucks sometimes. But if you like it, give us a like, subscribe. If you got a question, feel free to hit us up on Patreon. You can toss us a little dough and we will answer any of your burning questions with a nice written out answer. And until then, what more can I say? Don't let them fool you. Subscribe.